Good afternoon, and welcome to this event on Startup Fundraising 101. I'm Kelly Sexton, Associate Vice President for Research, Technology Transfer, and Innovation Partnerships at the University of Michigan. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. First, our webinar is being recorded, and as a registered participant, you will be receiving a link to the recording after the fact. Second, if you submitted questions during the registration process, thank you. But if you did not, please make use of the question and answer feature at the bottom of your panel. Our awesome staff behind the scenes will be moderating those questions, and we will get to them as time permits. This session is one of a series of panel discussions, presentations, and conversations the U of M Tech Transfer is delivering as part of the University of Michigan's 20th annual Celebrate Invention. The university has made tremendous progress these past 20 years, and I'm pleased to share that in just the past 3 years, we have launched 74 new startup companies. Also during that same 3-year period, the entire portfolio of U of M Tech Transfer startup companies went on to raise $1.7 billion in venture and angel capital financing. But behind these great numbers and the associated successes, there are untold hours of very hard work for the entrepreneurs that have worked to refine their value proposition, develop their decks, and hone their pitch. There are stories of failed presentations, conversations with investors that didn't go well, and hard lessons learned. So we're thrilled to be able to bring this content to you on the art and science of raising money from early stage startup investors. Our hope is that this presentation will help you to learn from the mistakes of others and help set you on the path for a successful raise. And I really could not be more excited about our presenter, Serena Glover. I am going to read Serena's bio, but before I do that, I want to say that in addition to being an early stage startup investor, she's also a mentor and advisor to early career investors that are raising their first fund. In my role as Associate Vice President for Research and Tech Transfer at U of M, Serena has been a valued advisor and mentor to me. And while as part of my job, I'm not pitching to investors for a startup company, I have had the unique joy of raising money through philanthropy for a startup investment fund that we're creating at U of M Tech Transfer called the Accelerate Blue Fund. Serena has been both a great advocate of this Accelerate Blue Fund and also a very tough critic of our pitch in its early days. But her insights from having seen hundreds of pitches helped me and our team refine our value proposition and develop a stronger presentation. With her help, we have raised over $1 million in philanthropy, putting us over halfway to our first close of $2 million. So I couldn't be happier that she agreed to take her years of hard-learned lessons and distill them for this presentation. Now for the official bio. Serena Glover is an independent angel investor and board advisor to startup mobile, cloud service, consumer, and VR/AR companies. In 2004, she co-founded Twango, an innovative consumer media sharing website and technology platform. She negotiated Twango's acquisition by Nokia in 2007. Prior to that, she spent 9 years at Microsoft in various management positions, leading product teams and also helping complete several corporate acquisitions. In the 80s, she was part of a research team at the University of Michigan that built some of the very first database and graphical design tools. And she was one of our very earliest tech transfer startup companies. Serena has a BS in computer science and an MBA from U of M. So with that, welcome Serena, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that kind introduction. I'm very, very excited to be here today. I usually do this class out on the West Coast, in the Seattle area particularly, and so I'm really, really happy to be able to present to, I think, predominantly a Southeast Michigan audience today, or at least a Midwest audience. So thank you. You'll probably see on your screen that the folks behind the scenes are running a poll. I typically do this class interactive, and I'm out in the room talking to the participants and so forth, trying to get a sense for who's in the audience and what level of experience they have in order to sort of pitch the presentation at the right level. So if you could answer the poll questions, that would be really, really great. And it looks like already that there are a number of people who haven't raised money before, some who have, but I'm going to mostly position this pitch as if you've never raised before. Here's some things to think about. And some of this may be old news to some of you. Anyway, next slide. So we're going to cover a lot of territory today. What I'm going to try to do is go through a number of different topics around fundraising. The folks behind the scenes here are going to stop and ask me questions along the way. So if you need some clarification on something I've said, please feel free to throw the question in. But if you ask questions on something that we're going to cover later, we'll wait and try to cover it at that time. And then any big questions kind of at the end. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. Kelly already gave you some information, but part of the reason I wanted to do this is because all of the things I'm going to tell you today, a lot of them are influenced by the experiences that I've had. As Kelly mentioned, we spun a company out of the University of Michigan Research Group, out of the IOE department. So I was in a startup right out of school. So I got my first taste of, oh, what's it like to be in a startup? And then went from there to Microsoft. I had experience running groups there, but also the M&A experience that I had there really helped me understand what it looks like when a company's trying to sell themselves to a small company's trying to sell themselves to a big company. So that's informed a lot of the way I think about how startups should pitch. And then, as Kelly mentioned, I started my own company, so I had experience with fundraising there. And then what happened for me is in the late 90s, in the late years of when I was at Microsoft, I started angel investing, and I had no idea what I was doing. I just was writing checks, but it gave me exposure to, again, to how people pitch. And once I left Nokia in 2008, I've been an active angel ever since. So as Kelly mentioned, I've seen tons of decks. I follow a portfolio theory approach. So you're going to run into all kinds of different angels as a startup CEO fundraising. Some angels just might do a deal, maybe 2 deals a year, and they do it kind of for fun. They just do it in areas of their interest or only to people that they know. And they're not really concerned about building a portfolio. Most serious angels will build a portfolio. In other words, they're going to think about angel investing just like venture capital firms do, where it's a hits business. You have to invest in enough companies to absorb the number of losses that you're going to see. So that's how I come at it. I come at it as a venture capitalist would come at it. So a lot of my comments are going to be associated that way. I'm Seattle based. I invest mostly on the West Coast, mostly in software tech, a little bit of hardware, but I don't do life sciences and I don't do biotech. So unfortunately, if you're in life sciences, most of my examples today are going to be software tech, but a lot of the things I think I'm going to say are going to apply to you regardless of what space you're in. And I invest in a lot of different business models. And one of the big things I think about is when I'm investing is, does the world need another one of these things, whatever it is? And that's my way of basically saying, I think about social impact. That's something that I've been working on for a number of years. So, and I'm going to come back and talk about that later more, because that impacts how you talk to investors. And the thing to keep in mind is what I'm telling you today. This is based on my experience. These are not absolutes necessarily. You're going to hear different comments and different pieces of feedback from different people. But it's the experience that I've had doing this since basically the late 90s. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing, let me see if I can get rid of this poll now. So the poll is on my screen. I'm just gonna, so it looks like we have a really, really mixed audience. It looks like we got people who are fundraising now, half the people aren't. About 20% of you, 40% of you have raised before, and 60% of you haven't. So mixed audience. So again, this will be old news to some of you, but maybe new to many of you as well. So when you think about fundraising as a CEO, you feel like, okay, my company's at a place, I'm ready, I need to go raise some money. One of the first things you got to think about is the timing, because you're on a clock. And yet there's a lot of things that you have to think about. One of the first things you have to think about is seasonality, particularly for seed investing. When you're talking to angels, primarily, there's seasonality. Angels, money is typically raised between January and June. And then things kind of die in the summertime. And then it picks back up again in September. And you got to be done by Thanksgiving, because right around Thanksgiving till the end of the year, things tend to just really slow down. Now, venture firms will often keep going, we'll keep going through the whole year, but there is very much a seasonality curve to raising money overall. And so you have to really be thinking about that. You cannot start fundraising in July and expect to be done, by September 1st. That's really highly unlikely. The other thing you have to think about, of course, is how much money do you have in the bank? And you got to really give yourself enough time to raise that money before you run out of money. And you don't want to be raising right when you're getting down to the bare bottom of your bank account, if you can avoid it. A lot of times people have to do that, but if you can avoid it, try to avoid that, because that puts you in a much, much more difficult negotiating position with your lead investors. So you want to try to, assuming you already have some money and you're working on your next seed round, you want to get going fast enough so that you don't run out of money, usually within like a 2 or 3 month window of when you get those new funds in the door. The other thing I want to talk about here is prep time and pitch time. And the world here is binary. You either can raise sitting in a coffee shop over a weekend, or it really takes a long time. And sometimes it works out for people and they can just raise really quickly. And it's, they're in the right place at the right time. They went to the right school. They know the right people. They have the right color skin. They've got the right body parts. All those things matter. And so there are places, particularly in the Silicon Valley, where, it's known for quick fundraising. You can sit down and within a couple weekends have it done if you're the right person. And it's very tribal if you're connected to the right people. But for the vast majority of startups, that is not true. It takes time. I mean, you plan on, it could take 2, 3, 4, sometimes longer months to raise money. And the other thing that's really important to know, especially if you're doing this for the first time, is pitching is not the start. There's a lot of prep work you have to do before you even start pitching. And so it's really, really important when you're thinking about the time is to plan for all of the preparation work that you have to do in order to actually successfully pitch and raise money. And the other thing is it's a full-time job. And here's the place where I see early startups making mistakes all the time. Is they treat fundraising as kind of like a background thing. Oh, I'm just going to kind of work on it in the background. I still got to run my company and do all this other stuff. And what happens is they get into dribble mode and they never ever finish. They become perpetual fundraisers. And that is basically the kiss of death. You do not want to get into the mode where you're kind of background always working on fundraising. That is usually a recipe for failure. So you got to really think about this as something that you're going to commit a bunch of time to early on and make it happen in as tight a time frame as possible. That's the way you want to do this. And this is why sometimes it's really great to have a co-founder, because if you're the CEO and you're focused on fundraising, hopefully you've got a co-founder or another senior staffer who can really keep the company moving forward while you focus on, the up and out fundraising. Next slide. Raise amount. I missed a slide here. Let's go back to slide 4 for a second. Somehow we skipped we skipped a slide. We're going to jump around a little bit here. Next slide, please. There we go. We missed that one. Really quickly, I want to talk about terminology, because it's super easy to get confused about all of the terminology and what everything means. So in the early stages of fundraising, there's a lot of different terms that get thrown around. You'll hear about friend and family rounds. You'll hear about angel rounds, pre-seed rounds, seed rounds, institutional seeds, and so on. And think of this as mostly early. All of this is early money, whereas later stage is about growth. Once things are going and they're off and running, that's what the later money is typically about. Typically, friends and family rounds are those really, really, really early rounds that are pretty small, maybe in the 250 to 500K. And again, these are software tech examples that can vary depending on what industry you're in. But and typically they are from friends and family, like people close to you that you know. That's often how some startups get started. But if you don't have those early people around you like that can help you, you might start raising a really early round from angels. And sometimes those are called pre-seed rounds. Sometimes they're called seed rounds. Oftentimes, especially in Seattle, it's getting harder and harder to get a Series A round. So often in the early stages, companies raise multiple rounds before they get to the metrics that are needed for an A round. And so sometimes they're called seed 1, seed 2, seed 3. Don't get too hung up on the terminology. It is important to understand where you're at, what size round you should raise, and what to call it. Because if you're raising 500K and you don't have any customers yet, and you're just trying to build out a prototype and you call it a Series A, you have big problems. So the terminology does matter, but it's not like there's very fixed definitions for what each one of these things mean. And it shifts and changes over time, and depending on what market you're in, whether you're in Southeast Michigan or you're in Seattle or the Bay Area or New York or wherever, different metrics matter for each of these. So I wanted to make sure to cover that, because people often get confused about the terminology. Okay, so let's jump back to slide 6. So we've talked about terminology, we've talked about the timing. The big thing you got to think about also is, how much do you need to raise? And this is often a question when I'm working with early startups that we spend a lot of time talking about. Because getting this right matters. And there's sometimes more than one right answer, depending on the path you're taking. But the key thing to know is, when you're thinking about the amount, the way the investor is thinking about it on the other side of the table, and you really got to get the investor mindset clear, because they're the people that you're pitching to. What the investor is thinking about is, how do you get to your next round? Because if I put money into a company in, say, this round, and they can't get enough metrics to get to that next fundraising round, it's dead money to me. You won't make it. So when I'm investing in a round, I'm thinking about the next round. And what I'm asking myself is, what are the milestones and metrics for the specific business model that you have for whatever it is you're doing at whatever stage you're at early? What do you need to do in order to get to the next round, to have the metrics to be able to raise the next round? And then I'm asking myself the question is, do they have a plan to do that? And do I believe they're raising enough money in order to do it? So that's how the investor's thinking about it. And frankly, that's how you should be thinking about it, because really what you want to be doing is raising enough money to get to that next round. And you don't want to be in fundraising mode all the time, because it is, well, first of all, it signals very poorly to investors if you're in constant fundraising mode, and it will suck up all your time, and you won't be able to actually run your business and work on your business. So, rule of thumb is you want to give yourself an 18-month runway, 12 at the minimum, 18, even 2 years sometimes you see, but 12 to 18 months is kind of the sweet spot early on for thinking about how much money to raise. So you got to plan for, what do I need to get that far with my business in terms of the people I want to hire, the marketing I want to do, you know, the if you have hardware, you know, the capital goods that you need to purchase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or if you have to run, you know, if you have to get FDA clearance and you got to go run tests, what are the costs of all of those things? You have to think about all of those things that you have to do in order to get to that next set of metrics. And seasonality is back here again, because you don't want to run out of money right in the middle of a time when it's hard to raise. So you have to really think about that whole seasonality thing of, I need 18 months and I want to make sure I don't land in a place where it's hard to raise. So sometimes what you'll see is somebody's raising for 20 months because they want to get over the hump of the holiday season so they can start fundraising, for example, in January. So those are all things that you have to think about when you're coming up with your raise amount, because you got to plan for the amount of time as well as all of the things that you need to do in order to get to the metrics for the next raise. So that's the mindset that you should be thinking about. And it is the mindset that you will, that the investor sitting on the other side of the table will be thinking about. Okay, next slide. So when you're raising early money, let's talk about who you're raising from. Well, first of all, you're going to be raising from accredited investors. And I have another slide in one of my other decks that I do where I talk about all the different kinds of fundraising. This is not, we're not talking about crowdsourcing, Kickstarter and Indiegogo. Those are not, some people raise through Kickstarter and Indiegogo, but those are crowdsourcing platforms. They have a very different set of rules. The amounts of money raised are usually pretty small, and it's only good for very specific kinds of things. What I'm really talking about here is venture funding. And when you're raising money in the venture world for a company that you believe is going to be, is venture scalable, you are going to be talking to accredited investors. And essentially what we call this the grandmother rule. The SEC and the government has created rules so that people who don't have sufficient funds won't get ripped off accidentally by getting into an asset class that's way too high risk for what they can afford to do. So you have to have, as a trust, you have to have 5 million in assets, or as an individual, you've got to have $1 million in assets, and you have to have certain amount of income in order to be accredited. And if you're accredited, then you can do a couple of different things. You can be an individual angel, or you can be part of a venture capital fund. And the difference for you CEOs who are fundraising here, the difference is angels invest their own money, and venture capital funds, and there's a lot of seed VC funds now that you could be raising from. Seed funds or any venture capital fund, they're investing other people's money. So one of the key differences is a venture fund will have a very clear thesis about industries, size of checks, geographies, whether they care about social impact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're targeting venture funds, you can usually figure out pretty quickly whether or not you fit in their sweet spot of what they invest in, and whether or not you should even attempt to raise money from them. Angels are tough because angels, like I have I follow portfolio theory, so I operate my own fund more like a venture fund. But even then, you're investing your own money, so you can kind of do what you want. That's both a plus and a minus. You can get in a lot of trouble doing that, but also it gives me flexibility. If I see something that's really cool, that's like way outside of what I typically do, I can write that check because I'm only beholden to myself. So with angels, you got to figure out what the mindset of that angel is and what they typically invest in, because you can just burn a ton of time talking to angels that will never ever invest in what you're doing. And like, for example, I don't invest in gaming. And there's so many gaming companies. I get pitched for gaming all the time. And I'm like, I don't invest in gaming. You're wasting your time emailing me. Stop emailing me. You know, so you got to really figure that stuff out. It's important. The other thing I don't have on this slide is that I should is the other sources of funds. These are venture capital funds, but they're slightly different. Corporate funds. So most major corporations have, a lot of them now, especially in the tech space, have venture arms, and in bio, pharmaceutical, they have venture arms. And that's often a source to get money as well. They run them, like venture funds. They have a thesis. The thing you have to watch out though for with corporate venture funds is they typically have an agenda. So you'll need to be using their platform technologies, or what you're doing needs to somehow tie to where they're going. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes corporate venture can lead you astray because they have an agenda which relates to their company and what they're doing. And I've seen this happen sometimes where early stage startups, their lead investor will be a corporate. And then all of a sudden they're like, instead of going this way, they're going this way. And it's not because that's necessarily what they should do. It's because that's what the corporate investor wants them to do. And that's not to say that corporate investors are bad. They're not. In fact, they're great. Many of them are really great. You just, as a startup CEO, have to be aware that there is sometimes an agenda there, and just make sure you understand it and know how to manage it. The other source of funding is family foundations, and there's a lot of those around too. And so you need to, with family foundations, understand, oftentimes they're more conservative. That's been my experience. That may not be true everywhere, but at least in my own experience, they tend to be more conservative, a little bit more risk averse. So even though they say early stage, often really what they want are Series A metrics, but they want to get in super early. So you have to watch out for that. And the other thing you need to be aware of with a family office, and this is not true everywhere, but at least in some of them, at least the ones in Seattle, because they're run by tech people, most of them. And it's what the founder wants to do. They have a thesis, but at the end of the day, it kind of comes back to the person that set the thing up in the first place and what he or she wants to do. So you need to kind of suss that out and be aware of what the decision making is in this family foundation that you're presenting to, because you can burn a ton of time if you're not conscious of that. Okay, next slide. And I'm not seeing any questions so far. Are we all good so far?
All good.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, you guys, again, feel free to jump in anytime if I say something that doesn't make any sense or it's not clear. Okay, so prep work. This is the thing that CEOs hate to see, because they just want to go out and start pitching. And I will tell you that if there's there's two things I'm going to say are top things to take away today. This is the first one. Do your prep work, because the people who do their prep work first and get it right often end up being much, much more successful fundraising. The people who just jump in and start randomly pitching people and doing stuff often end up all over the place, and they get into dribble mode. So you could end up spending just as much time on this part of it as you do on the actual pitching. So that's just something to be really, really conscious of. So the things you need to think about are, as you're raising, let's say you're raising your first seed round and you want to raise $1 million or $750K or whatever. You need to think about who you're targeting. And so that's where you got to go out and you got to really figure out, okay, who are the people that I want around me? And that's where you get into this whole quality of investors point, which is ideally in an early stage company, you want people around you who can help you. So in an ideal world, people who understand what you're doing, who are hopefully somewhat passionate about what you're doing, and who understand the technology or have understand the sales model, or have the business connections or the government connections or whatever it is you need to help you. So in an ideal world, if you could pick, 5 investors from 20, you want to pick the ones who get what you're doing and who can help you. And most early stage investors assume they're going to sometimes they'll say, I'm a silent investor, you can't call me, I'm not going to help you. But often early stage investors help the companies they invest in, and they do that in a number of different ways and to different degrees. So that's the ideal. The other ideal is how many investors you have. And there's no exact magic to the right number, but the thing I'll say is you have to manage these people forever. This is a business development relationship. They are with you forever. They're on your cap table. They're going to be in your face for the rest of the way through until you IPO, you get bought, or you go out of business. So you got to be conscious of how many of these people you're bringing on, because if you bring on a whole ton of people early, then your capitalization table, meaning the number of people that you have ultimately as investors overall over the course of your company, it gets unwieldy and unmanageable. And there's not, and the assumption here is you're going to have to raise multiple rounds of money. So this might be the first of several rounds of money that you raise, or the second of several rounds of money that you raise. So you don't want to get too many people. The flip of that, because you're going to have more people later, you're going to take on Series A, B, C potential investors. The other thing you have to be conscious of here, especially early stage, is you don't want to ideally, you don't want to raise your money all from one person. And here's why. Let's say somebody comes along and says, hey, I love what you're doing. You need $750K. I'm going to write you that check. And they write you that check. Well, first of all, you've shut yourself off from having other smart people around the table. You now are beholden to one person who will probably feel like they have the ability to say a ton about your business and tell you a ton about what you should and shouldn't be doing. So you have to be conscious of that. And the other big problem is if that person, for whatever reasons, decides that they're not interested in your company anymore, when you go to raise the next round, if they're not willing to come back in, that sends a really, really negative signal. And so it's important to have a collection of investors early on, so that even if a couple of them drop out, you still get signaling that, hey, there's people who have been with you and who want to stay with you and are willing to write that next check. And the classic example of where this went really wrong is in Seattle early on. A bunch of the venture firms, when Series A started to get harder to get, a bunch of the venture firms here started coming down into essentially the angel investing space, into the seed space. And rather than just coming on as another of the seed investors, they were writing huge checks and taking the total round. But the problem is these early stage companies needed a lot of help. They didn't have the time and the bandwidth to do it, because that's not how their funds are set up. And then, so they basically stranded these startups, and then they didn't make the progress they needed to make. And then of course the investor wouldn't come back into the next round. And so then they're screwed. So that's what you have to be aware of as a startup CEO in terms of managing who you're bringing on board and how many. It's always good and so the best CEOs create a big spreadsheet to manage all of the people they're talking to, and when they talk to them, and what they should know about them, and so on. It's a good thing to do. The other thing you should really focus on is trying to get warm introductions to people. Obviously, if you can't get a warm intro, send the mail anyway, but the more you can get warm introductions to angels and early seed firms, the faster you'll get those meetings. Order matters too. So you need to think about saving your, if you think you have 3 really, really good people who you believe should invest in you, that are the right investors, and you think they're going to really like it, don't do your first pitch on them. Practice on some other people first, especially friendlies. Like, find some friendlies who can help you out, because usually it takes a few iterations to get your pitch right. and save your really good prospects for later. Phone versus in person. Obviously, this was back in the before times, BC, before COVID. In person's always better. Phone works. Now, obviously, it's phone, so it is what it is. And then, like I mentioned, be organized. Okay, so there's a question that came in. I'm just reading it. Okay, so somebody was asking about the whole question of, I made the comment that you shouldn't always be fundraising. But somebody said, yeah, as a CEO, you're always fundraising because you're thinking about the next round. That's absolutely right. As a CEO, a big part of your job is, well, basically you're a storyteller, whether it's up and out to investors or customers, or it's down and into your employees, you're a storyteller. That's what your job is. And you're right that the minute you close a round, you immediately start to think about the next round. But the point I'm making is you need to close the round. So get in, get it done, get it closed so that you can get back to business and start really working towards the goals for the next round and being out and talking to people and warming people up for the next round. What you don't want to do is be in a position where, you know, 8 months later, you're still trying to raise your first $750 million and you're kind of doing it in the background and it's dribble, dribble, dribble. That's the thing that you need to avoid. But you are absolutely right. As a CEO, you're always thinking about fundraising. It's just, you want to close and then move on and think about the next one. Okay.
Hey, Serena, you have another question, a clarifying one. So your slide says phone versus in person. So in the unique time we're in, do you suggest a Zoom or a phone call? And what are your thoughts?
Zoom, ideally, because part of presenting, so it's back to my point about storyteller. As a CEO, you're a storyteller. So one of the things that helps me as an investor is I want to see you. I want to see how you present. Like, you know, I present, you see, I use my hands a lot. It's not necessarily a good thing, but I want to see that. I want to see who you are. I want to see how you present. And so I prefer Zoom. That doesn't mean if it doesn't work out and you have to talk to somebody on the phone first, that's fine too. I've done that a lot, but Zoom's better. Okay. All right, so I'm going to keep going here. I guess we're on next slide. Okay. Investor mindset. So part of successful fundraising is really understanding who do you have on the other side of the table and where are they coming from? What's their mindset? How do they think? What have they invested in before? What industries do they care about? What background do they have? So I'll just tell you, like, one of my telltale things when I first meet with a prospective company is if they haven't looked at my LinkedIn and they don't have some inkling of who I am, that is just a big negative ding, because that tells me they have not done their homework. Or if they don't tell me, I've heard about you and I know you're interested in the space because so-and-so told me that you co-invested, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm looking to see if they've done their homework. And part of the reason you need to do your homework on who's sitting across the table from you is because investors, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try to put you in a box. They're going to try to figure out, what are you? And how do you relate to other things that I know? And they'll do that in a number of different ways. They'll do that, they'll put you in, they'll try to figure out what industry you're in. They'll try to figure out what business model you are, like, oh, this is a SaaS thing, or oh, this is a B2B, B2C marketplace, or this is a B2B enterprise solution, or, you know, or this is a viral network, or this is a media company, or, you know, they're going to put you, the first thing they're going to do is try to compare you to everything else they already know. So it's really, really important you kind of understand the background of the investor, because you need to make sure that they get you in the right box. Because once you get in the wrong box out of the gate, it's really hard to get out of that box and into the right box. And often what happens is you get in the wrong box and they look at you and go, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. You're gone. You don't get a chance to get into the right box. And I'm going to talk about in the pitch deck, when I talk about that later, I'm going to talk about how to do that, things to think about so you get into the right box. Remember too that the investor is always looking for the reason to say no. Investors hear hundreds of pitches. They only invest in a few. The default assumption is no. Now you got to convince me it shouldn't be no. So don't come in thinking just because an investor maybe has invested in the space before, or you think you've got the hottest thing since, sliced bread, that somehow this investor is just going to think that too. Their assumption coming in is no. And you got to convince them otherwise. And then the last 2 points I've kind of already covered on the previous slide, which is angels only have to answer to themselves, whereas venture companies have to answer to a thesis and to their limited partners, the people they raise money from. And so in both cases, understanding what the thesis is important. It's easier with funds than it is with angels. Okay, I'm looking at questions. Some of these are coming in, or I'm going to answer later about amount of equity to give away. I'm going to talk about that later, so hold that thought. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We're still in prep work. We haven't even started pitching yet. Here's some other things you got to really think about and prepare before you start fundraising. The first thing is you have to figure out what your corporate structure is. And I have another talk on this topic, but the bottom line is are you an LLC, an S Corp, a C Corp, a B Corp? How are you incorporated? And I will tell you that for most angels, you need to be an LLC or, I'm sorry, wrong. You need to be a B or a C Corp. Most angels don't invest in LLCs. And there's a long list of reasons why they don't, why LLCs are not a good corporate structure to start or to continue, frankly. Sometimes people will disagree with me on this because, LLCs are easier to set up, blah, 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 blah. But I will tell you that every time I've invested in an LLC and we've had to restructure it because there's so many things you can't do with an LLC that you need to do with a venture firm to venture scale, it is just a nightmare and a mess. And I know many people that I invest with that are serious investors will not touch LLCs. So it's just a showstopper right out of the gate. Now, you might find Uncle Bob and, that random friend that you went to college with who only does an investment a year. They won't care. They'll invest in an LLC. Fine. If you can do that, great. But to get set up for venture scale, you need to be incorporated as a C or a B Corp. The other thing is you need to be really clear about, you have to have a cap table. And the capitalization table, I think I have an example coming up here. The cap table basically just tells you everybody who has, I put it in my other deck. I didn't put it in this deck, but the cap table is basically a spreadsheet that shows who owns what parts of the company. So who owns common stock, who owns preferred stock in the different rounds, who has options, and it all needs to total up to 100% of the value of the company. And so it is a thing that you have to, and at the start, your cap table is you and your co-founders probably, and then maybe you add an employee and you give them some options, and so they're on the cap table. And then when you start bringing investors in, you put them on the cap table as well. And they're really, really easy documents to create early on, and you need to have an attorney anyway, so they'll help you do it. You got to have one. Just do it and keep them clean, because what happens is in early stage startups, they get really messy. and they forget that they gave somebody options, and then that person left the company, and then 3 rounds later they come back and go, hey, wait a minute, the company's doing good now, I had all these options, and then they're not on the cap table, and it screws up all the math, and it's a huge mess. So don't make that mistake. Like, just make sure that you've got your attorney, you've got your cap table, and you're really, really diligent about getting everybody on that cap table that you've ever promised an option, a warrant, anything to. Advisors, if you've given them a cut for some options, or if you've got restricted stock, whatever the mechanism is, just make sure they're on the cap table. The different ways that you can raise money, the different instruments. I'm not going to dive into a ton of detail here because this is a really long topic. And again, this is kind of Startup Fundraising 101. There's lots more detail, but let me just touch on them quickly. First of all, priced rounds. Let's start with a priced round. That's when you issue stock at a certain price. Most early stage startups don't do that because doing priced rounds, first of all, it's way more expensive paperwork wise than doing a note or a safe. So most don't do it. And the other reason they'll argue they don't do it early on is because it's hard to value what is the valuation for the company at an early stage. The reality is when you put caps on notes and safes, you are valuing the company. So it's kind of a fake argument, but it isn't in the sense that you don't have to go get a 409A and do all the other work that you would have to do if you were doing a priced round. So most early stage startups do a note or a safe. A note is debt. You're basically saying, you, investor, are going to loan me money, X amount of money, Y amount of interest, and then there's a bunch of language in there for when I do raise my first priced round. So when I do go and start really raising money where my company has value, what happens is those notes convert into price stock. And the way they convert is all the details of what's contained in a note. And there's usually 2 key principal concepts that you'll hear about: a cap and a discount. The cap basically says, if you tell me right now your company is worth $4 million, and that's the cap, basically the cap's $4 million, I know that later when my money converts, it will convert. If you're, let's say all of a sudden you're going to raise again when you're worth $10 million, my money converts at $4 million because that's what it was worth when I put the money in. And the reason for that is because I took all that early risk. And so I shouldn't have the same price as somebody who invested, say, 18 months later when the company's worth a bunch more. So that's the cap. That gives investors some security that they're going to convert later at a price that makes sense for when they put the money in. The discount's the other concept, and that's basically, it can be an and an or on the discount, but the simple way discounts are used is, let's say you raised money at 5 million, I put it in at 5, but you struggled. In your next round, you got to raise it 3 million. The discount allows me, to not end up having to pay more than other people pay for the stock. I really should have my slides with all the math to show this, but all of this stuff is online too. You can look it up and read it. Safes are basically equity. They're warrants. They're the right to buy stock in the future. They also have caps. They didn't used to, so Y Combinator invented these things, and they're pretty slick. But in the early days in the Valley, they had no caps, and so it was like buying stock and not knowing the price. And it'll be the price, whatever it is, whenever they convert later on. So Seattle didn't even touch them, but now we do because they have caps on them. They often have discounts on them, but they're different. They're not debt, they're equity. And the reason why investors sometimes like them is because there's this thing called the Qualified Small Business Stock tax laws. And those laws allow us as investors to defer capital gains in certain situations. And part of the rules around that is how long you own the stock. And so safes start that QSBS clock. Notes don't, because notes are debt. And so your clock for QSBS doesn't start until it converts to preferred stock later, whereas with a safe, it starts right then. So that's why they're getting more popular, because investors sometimes like them. But like a note, a safe is a really, really simple instrument. Doesn't cost much to set them up. And partly depending on where you are, what market you're in, you have to kind of look at your environment and go, what's based on how much I'm raising, what geographical area I'm in, there's going to be preferences for these things. So you have to be cognizant of all of that. The other thing to be wary of here is the concept of valuation. And the thing to know is there's pre and post, and people get those early stage CEOs that have never done this before get that confused all the time. If your company's worth, say you're doing a note, the cap is 4 million. That means that you're saying your company is worth 4 million today at the start of the fundraising. And let's say you raise $1 million. Then your company is worth $5 million at the end of the fundraising because you went from 4 to 5. So your pre-money valuation is 4, your post is 5. So when somebody says my company is worth X, I always ask pre or post, right? You have to be clear about that. The other thing, and somebody asked the question, you always are looking at how much should you give away of your company. So in this case of you started at a 4 pre, you raised $1 million and now you have a 5, you just gave away 20% of your company. So $1 million over $5 million, that's 20%. Now, how much should you give away? I can't really answer that in this because it is so dependent on where you are, like whether you're super, super early or you're almost close to raising an A. But general rule of thumb is like if you're raising $1 million early seed round, let's say you've already got some friends and family money in, you might be thinking in that 20 to 25% of your company that you would give away. As you go later in the rounds, that number becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. But early on, don't be surprised if you have to give away anywhere between 20 and 30% of your company to get going. Okay, so, and then my last comment here is have an attorney so you don't mess this stuff up, because if you mess it up, it'll come back to bite you later big time as you try to raise additional rounds later. So it's worth finding the right attorney who understands this stuff and get it set up right. Okay, we got to keep going because I'm way behind. Okay, pitch deck. Let's change topics here and talk about pitching now. So you've kind of done all of this prep work. You've got everything set up. You're ready to go. What should your deck look like? Well, the first thing I would say to you is, some people go, oh, I don't like to use a deck. I like to just talk. Well, that's fine, but decks are forcing functions and they force you to get your story really straight. And you always need follow-up materials to send people. And oftentimes, like for myself, as an angel, I won't even talk to somebody until I've seen their deck, because I like to look at the deck first and see what it is, what the topic is, because that I can tell right away whether, oh, this is something I invest in, you know, space-wise or not. So you kind of have to have a pitch deck. And there's just some really simple things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on this one because I think the points are kind of obvious, but you've got to have a really good, this is storytelling. So you've got to have a really good story. And so you need to think about what that story arc is and then build the pitch around the story arc. How you tell the story, that varies. I'll get on that to the on the next slide a bit. It really should be visual. You don't want to have a ton of words. You want to keep a limited number of visuals. You know, sometimes in early decks, I see like 10 different paradigms. They've got diagrams for everything, and it's so confusing. You have to really think about what is the one image or maybe the 2 images that you want that investor to take away to understand your company. So you want to keep it really, really simple. Keep your slides clean. Keep, you know, make your point. Don't try to make 10 points on one slide. I mean, these are all just kind of basics for presentation, but you'd be amazed at some of the decks we see. Dark backgrounds typically don't work very well. You want stuff that can print, because a lot of times people print stuff, so it should be clean when it prints. And then if you have something that you need to demo, and again, this is like, you know, software tech example, you got to assume that you might lose connectivity, whether you're sitting in a conference room or you're over Zoom, or if you're just sharing a deck for people to look at, or they're not talking to you. It's always good to have some images of your product, to show what it is, in case you can't do the demo. Target 15 minutes for a pitch. Your first pitch is typically going to be, you get a half an hour on the phone, and you need 15 minutes for questions. So it shouldn't be any longer than 15. And of course, you'll have a lot of slides that can expand that out if you get into the second conversation or whatever. But keep it short. And then remember, it's a living document. As you pitch, you'll get feedback. The trick is figuring out who to listen to, because you're going to get all kinds of diverging feedback, especially from early angels. So that's where you kind of got to really pay attention to who am I listening to? Do they understand the business model of the space that I'm in? Because you can get bad advice, and I won't go into the details of that here because I'm running behind on all of this, but it's really easy to get bad advice. And so you gotta, as part of your job as a startup CEO, is figuring out what input to listen to and what input to ignore. And that's not always easy, but that's going to be really important. Otherwise, you're just going to get led around by the nose all over the place. Okay, next deck, or next slide. Okay, so here are the things that you really need to have in your pitch deck. And the first three can go in any kind of order. It'll just depend on how the story tells best. But the first three things you kind of got to get out of the gate with an investor is, there's this problem. A certain kind of customer has a problem. So you need to make sure that I understand the problem, because ultimately I got to believe that's a real problem. Otherwise, this is not going to be interesting to me. And I have to believe it's a real problem for, not for me, but for whoever your customer is, right? And so getting the problem articulated clearly is super important. And then you got to convince me that you have a solution for that problem. And I got to believe, first of all, I have to understand the solution that you're presenting to me. And I have to believe that it's something that isn't already out there, and it's unique enough and interesting enough to be worth listening more to you. Because remember, I'm kind of hearing you for the first time here now. And so if you want to hook me so that you can get me into due diligence, you got to convince me that there's a real problem and you've got something that can solve that real problem. And then you got to convince me that this is a big enough space, this is a big enough opportunity, that it is venture scale and it is worth me investing in, because this thing is just going to get huge. And so the opportunity, when you're pitching typically early stage, is vision scoped. It's the big picture of where you're going, what this thing is, and how it can change the world. The solution is often what I call mission scope, which it's the thing you're building right now. You can't build everything. You can't boil the ocean. You got to figure out, what am I doing now? Like now, meaning like the next year to 2 years. Like, what am I focused on now? What problem is that solving? And so I have to believe that you've got something concrete that you can do now, but it's part of some bigger opportunity that's out there. And at least for myself, I'll say, if you don't explain those first three things well, I'm gone. Like, the rest doesn't matter. I stop listening, because if I don't understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how big this thing can be, it's hard for me to even absorb the rest of it. So it's super, super important to spend the time to nail that. And this is particularly true for really high, like deep technology. Like, I know there's a lot of UMISH email addresses on this presentation today. If you're doing some really gnarly, deep technology, whether it's, in life sciences or software tech or whatever, sometimes those things can be really hard to explain to people who don't understand your space and what you're doing. And so that's the thing you got to practice and practice and practice, and get with somebody to figure out how to explain it in a way that somebody who doesn't have your expertise can understand. And that's where the vast majority of the early stage for startups don't even get out of the gate with angels, because they can't articulate what it is they're doing in a clear and compelling way. So once you got that, then you need to talk about your metrics and what progress you've made. And that progress might be, we just got a prototype, or I have an idea on the back of the napkin. It doesn't matter how early you are. you need to articulate where you are at, whether you're in, early, you've just done some early research and you need money to build the prototype, or whether you've got the prototype and you've got 6 customers and this is what they're doing with it and this is how they've reacted and now we need to build our next prototype, or whether you've got your MVP, your minimum viable product, and you're ready to go out to market. Whatever stage you're at, you need to understand, you need to articulate what your metrics are and your progress. Team, very important. In early stage, team is probably the most important thing. Like, who are the people? That's really what I'm betting on early. And it's not usually the thing you start with in a pitch deck, though, because I can't really process whether I think you're the right person to do this or not until I understand what you're doing. So that's why you don't put the team slide first, because I'm sitting there going, okay, you're so-and-so PhD doing blah, blah, blah. I don't know whether that's going to help you or not, because I don't know what you're building. So that's why you always say, what am I building first? Or what am I doing first? And then I'm going to evaluate you. I'm going to be thinking, looking at you like, are you the right person to do this? And then you need to tell me what pond you fish in, like what's the ecosystem around you. And a lot of times the competition slide ends up, see this in software tech all the time, it ends up like this little laundry list of features, like, oh, I got 10 features and my competitor only has 3. That usually is not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is like, what is the big picture going on around you? Who are the people in your space? Who are the people who might come into your space? How is the world changing? How are consumer behaviors changing, or how is technology influencing trends in products and technology and so forth? So this is really the bigger picture of how are you going to win? What's your play? That's what this slide is about. Then you got to tell me how you're going to go to market. And this is often missing from early stage decks. Like, oftentimes people come out of technology, they've got this great idea, and they have a really, really great idea, but they have no idea how to sell it, right? And so this is really important, and especially if you're a technology person and you don't understand the sales and marketing side of what you're doing, whether you're selling to government or to hospitals or to enterprises or to consumers. If you don't have experience doing that, that's where you go figure out how to round out your team and find somebody who does, because often this is a missing piece in early decks. And then you have to tell me what the raise amount and the terms are. So is it a note? Is it a safe? Is it priced? How much? Blah, 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 blah. And then you have to tell me, and this is really important, how you're going to use that money and what are you going to achieve? Because this is where I am looking at going, do they have the right metrics? And are they raising enough money to get to those metrics? So these are the things in the first deck that the first pitch that you've really got to cover with early stage investors. Next slide. Yeah, so typical holes. This is the stuff that, like, if I think about all the years I've been doing this, what do I usually see that's backwards or missing or whatever? It's, like I said, the problem, opportunity, solution stuff is just not clear, not landed, and so I've stopped listening. Oftentimes slides have way too many graphs to explain like, you have to figure out how to really boil stuff down into simple terms in just a small number of metrics. So sometimes people will have like 5 slides of graphs of how big this opportunity is, and I'm just like, I don't even know what to look at here. Like, I don't know what's important in all these numbers. So figure out which numbers really matter and just present those. Where to land the big vision. That's a tricky one, and you really have to get help with this on your individual decks. But sometimes if you have to land the big vision up front, sometimes if you land the big vision up front, it really will confuse the audience about what you're doing. So sometimes you have to explain what you're doing, what the problem is, talk more, really like lay out the business in the short term, and then land the big, well, here's where it's going to go long term, because bandwidth is increasing, battery technologies are going to improve over the next, sometimes that big vision has to come later, and it'll just depend on what you're doing. Another thing that happens, key points get scattered. Like, so if you're talking to me about your go-to-market plan, talk about it all on one slide. Don't mention some stuff up front and then a little bit later and a little bit later. And we see that a lot in decks where all the content's there, but it's kind of all muddled around. Surprisingly, a lot of times people don't really explain their products really well. And I think sometimes it's just because they know the products so well themselves and they're passionate about them that they just think everybody else is going to instantly grok it. But you got to always remember that the person sitting across from you probably doesn't understand what you're building and may not be as passionate, probably is not as passionate about it as you are. So you really got to explain what you're doing. So lack of go-to-market plan, I talked about that already. And then target customers. This is a tricky one too. Sometimes the user is different than who you're selling to. So for example, if you have some, say, let's say you have a biomedical device, you're selling to the hospital administration or to the doctors, but the users are sick people, right? And, or, you know, consumers that have to go home and actually use the device. And so, and it's the same with enterprise sales. Like you might be selling an enterprise, something to a HR division, but actually it's the employees who have to use it. So you have two different customers, those who you have to convince to buy it and those who you have to make love it. And so understanding that is super important. If you don't, the same person you're selling to is not the user, you got to be able to articulate not only how you're going to sell it, but how you're going to get the users to love it and keep using it, right? It makes it harder. And then the other thing we see all the time, KPIs are not stage appropriate. In other words, sometimes people get confused about what they need to be focusing on really early stage. You know, a good example of this is like, and I'm going to use things I know, but I invest in a lot of marketplaces. So early stage, it's all about liquidity. It's about getting buyers and sellers and getting lots and lots of transactions, because if you don't get that flywheel going, you'll never go anywhere. So the whole idea is lots of inventory, lots of buyers, lots of sellers, lots of completed sales. Then you figure out how to monetize those sales. So if you come in early saying, oh, I just care about revenue, it's the wrong metric for early stage. You know, another example of this is, we see this all the time in Seattle, you know, consumer companies, there's a lot of enterprise expertise in this town. And often what you'll get are investors who have a lot of enterprise background giving bad advice to a consumer company because they don't understand what matters for a consumer company. So again, this was why it's really important to know who your investors are and what experience they're bringing, because you can get bad advice on what the right metrics are for your stage or for your business model. Very important to get that right. Next slide. So some other general pitch advice, things we see, you know, just from years of doing this, things I see going wrong. People get vision and mission really confused. And one of the things that happens is in particular areas where it's harder to raise money, like Seattle's, you know, it's harder to raise money here than it is in the Valley or in New York. I think Southeast Michigan might have some of that problem as well. And what happens is founders will be, well, I can't raise money to do that big thing. You know, it's too big. Nobody's ever going to give me money. So they just keep kind of shrinking the scope of what they think, you know, what they're going to do. And so they end up pitching something really tiny, even though really they have this huge idea. So you have to be really careful that you are, and then vice versa. Sometimes you get somebody pitching the big thing, but they don't understand how to get there. And so it'll be like, oh God, well, that's really cool, but this person has no clue what the steps are to get there. So, you know, it's that whole pitching the big thing, but being really clear about what are the steps you're going to take, the small steps to get there along the way. Taking a big swing, especially for women, I say this a lot, you know, they tend to make it small. It's like, make it big, you know, because investors are looking for big bets. It's a hit business, you know, like I teach a class on becoming an angel investor. And again, you know, different people have different metrics, but I always say, you know, you got to have 20 companies in your portfolio because you're hoping for one big hit out of it. You know, huge chunk of those are going to fail. Some of them will dribble in and maybe return your money, and you might get a couple that get to second base, but you know, you need one big one. So most of us who invest with portfolio theory in mind are always looking for the big hit. You have to plan for bad stuff to happen, and you know, One of the things that I see a lot, particularly with deep tech stuff, and there's a lot of that out here too, is you get somebody who's like PhD in something, something space and is doing something really cool. But they're so confident in, and they're so passionate about what they're doing, they can't see how hard it is going to be to sell it to people who don't know what it is and aren't as passionate about it. And so, you know, they'll plan for the best case scenario. And so you got to really assume things are going to go wrong and make sure that you're building that into your raise amount and how far you think you're going to get with your KPIs and so forth. You need to be confident, obviously, but it's okay to say, I don't know. I mean, if you knew everything early stage, you wouldn't be early stage, right? Kind of by definition. So I don't know is a perfectly reasonable answer. I expect to hear that answer from people when I'm asking them questions. What I really want to hear, if they don't know the answer to something, is how they would go about figuring it out. Because a lot of times early stage, what you're doing is you're figuring it out. You're trying to figure out bits of your product. You're trying to figure out which customers might use it and how they might use it. And so you should have, if you don't know the answers, you should have some theories about how you're going to test. And that's kind of what early stage investors are looking for. And knowing what questions you need to answer, it's kind of part of that. Like, that's what I'm looking for earliest stage. I'm assuming you don't know the answers to a lot of questions about your business and how this is going to go. And you'd be surprised, you know, customers, like you throw something out there, and I've, you know, had personal experience with this myself. You put something out in the market and people do things with it you never imagined, you know, that they would do, or use it in ways that you would never imagine. So there's a lot you're not going to know up front. And so it's just knowing what questions you feel like you need to answer. And again, to get to that next raise is always in the back of the investor's mind. Next. Post-pitch follow-up. This goes back to just being super organized, and this is all that we talked about prep work. Well, part of the prep work is being prepared for the post follow-up. You as the CEO have to be the proactive one. You have to be organized. Obviously, always thank any investor that you're speaking with. You need to manage the follow-up for the any additional information or meetings. So if they ask you for additional information, get it to them. Or if they ask you for additional information and you don't have it, say, I think it'll take this long, and keep them appraised. You know, like, you got to kind of own the organization, because in particular angels, VC seed funds are not so much, but for angels, we're just people. You know, we got other things going on. This is not some of us do it full time, some of us don't. We're all over the place. We're a lot of us are sort of disorganized. We're not going to track all this stuff. Like, if you want to stay in front of us and keep moving us forward to a check, you have to manage that process. And so that's really important. And again, if you're trying to get a raise closed. The other thing is, let's talk about leads. It really helps to find a lead investor. Like, if you can find somebody who will write, for the size of your round, a decent size chunk of that round. So if let's say you're raising $1 million, if you can find a couple of angels who'll each write a 100K check, because ranges typically are 25 on the low end. Don't take less than 25 from an angel, 25 to 100. Sometimes angels will write a 250 check, but that's rare. But, you know, if you can find a couple of angels who are well respected, who have good networks, and who are willing to put in a decent chunk of money to kick your round off, that can really help you, because they'll help you go find other people. And angels, you know, we're all tribes. You know, we're like, there's the lead dog at the, you know, head of the pack, you know, leading the sled, and all the other dogs behind, you know what they're doing, you know what the view is, right? I mean, that's kind of how we operate. So if you find some good leads, you're going to find others to come in behind. What soft circle means is when you raise money, typically let's just take the example where you're raising 500K. You're going to raise all that money at the same time. And you might get somebody who says yes early on, but they'll say yes if you can raise the rest of the money. That's what most angels do. We don't want to take investment risk. We don't want to write you that first 50K check in a 500K round because we're not sure if you're going to be able to raise the rest of the money. And if we write that 50K check and you can't raise the money, then it's dead money. So most angels will say, well, I'll give you 50K, but you got to raise the rest of the money. And that's the soft circle. So then you get that person soft circled and you can go out to other angels or institutionals and say, well, I've got this much money soft circled. I need X amount more. You round everybody up and then you close. And some rounds will have more than one closing, but typically early stage, you try to have one closing. And then the last comment, you get be organized. You know, I've kind of talked about that all through the prep. It's like be organized. Okay, so somebody's asking a question, how do I get a copy of the slides? I'm happy for Michigan to send out the PDF of these slides. I don't know what the logistics are for that. I know this is being taped, but if you just want the PDF of the slides, that I'm totally good with, however you guys want to organize that. Okay. Let's keep going here. So next slide, because I want to leave time for questions here. Okay, so because I'm in Seattle and you know, most of my examples are Seattle, what I did was thank you to the folks at U of M Tech, the Venture Center is amazing. They put together a list of local resources. So if you're a CEO sitting there going, okay, well, this is all great, but who do I go talk to? Especially if I'm sitting in Southeast Michigan, here are some resources for you. First thing you can do is talk to the Venture Center. Those guys are amazing. And they have made, and I've had the privilege of being on the advisory board now for a few years and had a chance to see these guys operate. And they have got amazing skills in that group and lots of experience. And so, you know, stop number one is go to those guys. And if they can't help you directly, they'll point you to who can, right? There's a Michigan Venture Capital Association, and they have that second link there is a list of all the venture funds in the Michigan area. So there's a place to start. It's like, look at all the venture funds and figure out, are there any seed funds? And remember, find the seed funds, because if you're pitching to a later stage company, it's just going to be or a later stage fund, it's going to be a waste of time. You want to find seed fund people doing seed investing. And then there's a bunch of angel capital groups around Michigan. So there's a place to find angel investors, and often you'll have the opportunity with these groups to pitch in front of a bunch of people at once. There's pros and cons to that. I don't have time to get into all of that today. But also in those groups, you'll find a bunch of individual angels that, depending how these different groups operate, at least the big ones out here, the way they operate, it's kind of like collective due diligence. You know, you sit in a room, you listen to the pitches, but the angels make independent decisions. So it's a way to find angels through those groups. And then there's a couple of national organizations that the links are here for too that might be helpful. And then the last thing I cannot not talk about because I'm so excited about this. I mean, literally, this has been decades in the making. Michigan now has the Accelerate Blue Fund for early stage startups. And Kelly Sexton, who introed me, and Mike Sorothakis, who's on this slide as well, who runs the Venture Center and is the managing director of the fund. They've worked really, really hard, along with a whole bunch of other people throughout the University of Michigan, to get this fund stood up. And I am so excited about it because and they're in they've raised a bunch of money. They've made some really great progress, and hopefully, I think early next year, they'll be able to start actually writing checks. I hope. I might get shot for saying that, but anyway, this is an amazing opportunity for you as potentially, if you meet the criteria as a CEO, because here is a fund where you have deeply experienced venture people running it. they are surrounded by, in the Venture Center, all kinds of resources and people who can help startups. And they've been doing that work for years in the Venture Center. That Venture Center is surrounded by the University of Michigan, where you have people in like every area of expertise, whether it's a technology area or whether it's just even something coming out of the B school or out of education or whatever, wherever. You have people with deep experience all over the place. I believe Michigan has the biggest alumni network in the world. I think there's somewhere around 640,000 of us, don't quote that, but huge alum network, you know, that Michigan has access to. Plus Michigan is tied into like practically every large corporation and all the government entities. I mean, you could not ask for a fund that has better access to resources and smart people than that one. So if I were you and you have something that fits the profile for what they're looking for, you want those guys behind you, because just the sheer quality and quantity of the resources that they bring to the table as the University of Michigan. And those are the kind of people you want, frankly. You want people who can help you. And so I can't say enough about that fund. I'm super, super excited about it. I think it's the start of, more and more, creating a bigger ecosystem in the Midwest and the Southeast Michigan area for startups, because the opportunities are just unbelievable. I mean, the stuff coming out of the University of Michigan, directly or indirectly via alums and people who've gone there, it's mind-boggling, and we need to get more of that stuff out and into the world. So I'm hoping some of you on this call today are those CEOs wanting to get your ideas and your technology out of the university and helping solve big problems in the real world. So okay, so there's some questions. That's kind of the end of my pitch. There's some questions coming in, so one question is back on safes. Does the safe count towards the greater than 5-year section 1202? That's a tax law cap gain treatment. And I believe the answer to that is yes, it does. And that's why they're essentially warrants. And that's why investors sometimes like them, because it'll start that QSBS clock where debt won't. Your debt won't start the clock until it gets converted into equity whenever the first priced round is done. But having said that, I am not a tax expert. And QSBS is really complicated. It depends on when you bought the stock, how much you get deferred. It's changed over the years. It depends on what industry it's in. It depends, because certain industries have it, other industries like farming and mining, there is no QSBS, but other industries there are. It depends on how that company's spending their money. Like 80% of what they spend has to be done on I mean, there are so many rules. So I say I'm doing a fundraising class or a angel class later, and I always tell people, get a really good accountant and get a really good attorney and use them, because you don't want to screw this stuff up. And when I say really good, I mean somebody who understands startups. You don't want, if you're an investor and you're asking questions about QSBS, you don't want to be asking that to an attorney who's never worked with startups before, because then they got to go do it. You're paying for all the research. Find one who's done that work before and has worked with startups and can help you answer these questions. And it's the same as a CEO. Notes, safes, priced rounds, all those documents are really standard. So find an attorney who does this work so that you don't get charged an arm and a leg for, your favorite uncle's favorite attorney who doesn't do this work to do all that work, to figure it all out. Find somebody who's familiar with all the nuances, particularly in your regional area where you're raising money, because it does vary region to region. Okay. Any other slides or any other questions? Okay.
Question. Serena, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So you touched on this in your comments. You mentioned that especially women CEOs tend to kind of limit the scope of their vision to match the raise, and you talked a bit about tribalism and network effects and in raising money. I wonder if you have any specific advice that you give to first-time women entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kelly. And in fact, that's where I spend most of my time now. I've pretty much don't invest. I used to, but I don't anymore. I don't invest in non-diversified companies, and not only for moral reasons, but also because they just have better returns. It's been proven. And I really, really focus on women because it's so out of whack right now, and women need more help. They don't have the networks. They don't have the experience. So the big things I help women with often is getting over that hump of taking the big swing. And not be, women have a tendency to think, oh, I have to know, everything before I can start. Men tend to be, I think I know everything and I'm just going to go out there. Now I'm overgeneralizing, of course, but I mean, there's books on this, right? Guys will be more confident with less knowledge than women. And so what I always tell women is, if you even know 50% of what you're doing, you're way ahead of the game. Go for it. Right. And so that's a big, big part of what I talk to them about, and the whole I don't know, and how to turn those I don't knows into answers that help the investor understand how they think, because that's what investors are looking for. They're looking to understand, how is this person thinking? And women can be very, very good at articulating that if they know how to use that opportunity. So that's what I focus on. So somebody asked advice on friends and families and investment amounts. I think it's easier to manage fewer investors that invest greater sums, but the inclination is to take what you can get. Okay, so that question, great question, but it's back to that thing I said before of, well, first of all, rule of thumb is you really shouldn't be taking less than 25K checks. If you are a CEO, if you start taking little itty bitty checks, oh, it just gets so hard to manage. I mean, 25K should be the minimum. Now, you might make an exception for somebody who you really need, who's really going to help you and is going to be an advisor, and they can only put in 10K or whatever. Yeah. There's always exceptions, but you shouldn't take less than 25K if it's a venture scale company, just given how many investors over time you're going to need to have. And the flip of that is let's say you're raising 500K. If Uncle Billy comes to you and says, I'm going to give you 500K, it's so easy to just go yes and take the money, but that has some downsides, and you just need to really, really be aware of that, because if Billy goes away in the next round, you're screwed, because nobody's probably going to invest in you if the one person that invested in you before isn't coming back in. And that's why it makes sense to have at least a handful of investors early on. I'm looking at other questions. So this is on the flip side of it, but somebody says, what are your thoughts on angels grouping together in an LLC for an investment versus as individual investors? I cover that in my next session. Yes, there are ways to do that. There are lots of different mechanisms where angels group together. And so if you're an angel and you can't write 25K checks, get in a group that will combine their money together. And that is a great way to get into angel investing. But as a CEO, because I've got the razor hat on here, if you take money from one of these LLC groups, you want to make sure you're clear on who the person is that you have to communicate with, because you do not want to be communicating with 10 angels that all wrote, 2K checks into this little fund. You want to have a point person, because otherwise it becomes unmanageable. Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Awesome, Serena. Well, I think that was a good segue for us to wind this part down, and to give a thanks to you for this amazing session, and to thank you for agreeing to appear once again today to close out Celebrate Invention. So Serena's going to be rejoining us at 6 p.m. Eastern time in Ann Arbor, for a session on angel investing, how to get started. So this is a topic that I know Serena and I are both passionate about, and it kind of ties in. If we want more funded companies, we need more angel investors. And if we want more diverse funded founders, we need a diversity of angel investors as well. So I'm really glad she's bringing this content for us. And thank you for your kind words about the team. Thank you for all your support of the office and the University of Michigan through your service on the board. And I look forward to hearing your talk at 6. So with that, thank you everybody for joining, and we'll do a rousing Go Blue.
Go Blue. Thank you, Kelly.
Awesome. Thank you, Serena.